Great pleasure. First of all, I'm Emlyn Price from the Centre for Pagan Studies. I'm one of the directors, and my co-director, Julie Payne, is online as well. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Tom McArthur. Tom's a classicist and a witch, and he started practicing magic as a child, and as he grew up, so did his practice. He's been a Gardnerian initiate for 2 years, and his approach to magic is experimental, but with a strong grounding in traditional practices. He studied classics at Durham University, and he did his dissertation on the Greek Magical Papyri. His other interests in classics include Latin pedagogy, Neoplatonism, ancient religion, and cultural identity. And he's currently working as a Latin teacher and will soon be starting a PGCE at Cambridge University. When he's not working on classics or practicing magic, he's likely to be found involved with theatre, reading, or walking the dogs. And his talk this afternoon is aiming to introduce the Greek Magical Papyri to all of us here and give a grounding in some of their key concepts so that we're able to go on and start exploring the texts on our own. Okay, Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming along, and thank you to everyone at the Centre for Pagan Studies for having me along. I don't need to introduce myself, that's been so wonderfully done. Thank you, Emlyn. So before we go any further, as quick terminology, so you may hear me refer to the Greek Magical Papyri as the PGM. The reason I do that is because it's shorter, and PGM stands for Papyri Graecae Magicae, literally the Greek Magical Papyri, just in Latin. And it is the shorthand that is used in referencing the papyri, and it is how most people refer to it because it's less of a mouthful. Moving swiftly on, so this talk is an introduction to the papyri. It's by no means a comprehensive overview of every single spell in there because that would take volumes. The scholars and occultists devoted most of their lives studying these texts, so this is very much sort of an opening flavour for you. And I'm going to focus on a few of the key areas that I have a greater understanding of myself. We're going to start by I'll start by giving you a quick historical background to the text before looking at the magic in the papyri and how that works. So where the power is derived from, the sort of goals the magic is worked for, and how it fits into the general history of Western magic. And then we're going to look at the issue of syncretism and the way the gods are approached in these texts and what that might mean for modern polytheists looking to work with these texts. Then we'll have a little bit of comic relief when I introduce you to the joke spells, my favourite part of the PGM. And then we will focus on two particularly interesting entities in the papyri that I studied for my dissertation. And these are the paradros, or the assistant spirit, and then the personal daemon. And we'll be discussing some of the ideas about what these might be and looking at a couple of spells to conjure them. And finally, we will look at how modern practitioners might wish to use the papyri and how some of them have done so. Looking at a bit of problem solving and looking at various different approaches, including Alistair Crowley's famous Bournemouth Rite from Liver Summit as well. So, let's start with the bit of background on what these texts actually are. So, the Greek Magical Papyri are a collection of papyri, papyrus being the ancient Egyptian form of paper, which was found in Egypt, and they are largely written in Greek. Now, the collection we have today was not put together by the ancient magicians. In fact, it was put together by a German scholar named Karl Preisendans in the 1920s. And he provided Greek with a German commentary and translation. But the English translation of the corpus was published in the 1980s, edited by a man named Hans Dieter-Betz. And that is the book that most English-speaking magicians work from now. And you can find copies of that in any good occult bookshops such as Treadwell's. So the dates, these papyri date from roughly the 2nd century BCE through to the 5th century CE. Most of them are around from the end of that period, so 4th, 5th century CE or AD. And that's a span of about 700 years. At this time, Egypt had been a Roman province without a pharaoh for nearly 500 years. So that means that whilst there is a lot of Egyptian magic in the PGM, this does not represent pure historical Egyptian magic. There's a lot more that had come into it by this point. And at this time also paganism was in decline. That's not to say the magic was in decline. I think actually the difficult social situation that paganism and magic was in fueled a lot of creativity, which was one of the reasons you see such interesting stuff happening here. And at this time, a lot of magic and paganism was certainly illegal in parts of the Roman Empire. So the other big question is who wrote these texts? The honest answer is we don't know for sure. We're fairly certain that some of them were priests. The reason for this is because there are actually two languages that appear on the papyri, Greek and another language called Demotic. Demotic was an Egyptian form of writing, a cursive form. It was a one-time language that just was used for everyday writing and speaking, but by this point was only used by the priests. It was only known to priests. So we know that people who wrote this must have had some temple training. Some of them were professional magicians casting spells for clients. Some of them were not. Some of them may have been adepts, fantastic, amazing magicians who really knew what they were doing. Others of them didn't have a clue, and some of the spells are kind of weird and hodgepodgey, and some of these may have been collected by scribes who had an interest in magic but didn't actually practice themselves. So there is a tendency to romanticize these papyri as great fonts of magical wisdom, and in certain points they are, but in other points they're not. And because what these are is they are a collection of all the magical texts found in Egypt, written in Greek and Demotic, from a span of 700 years. And just as not every book written on magic these days is genius, neither is every bit of the papyri. But there is certainly some genius in there. So there's a lot in there that a modern magician may wish to work with. Regarding the sort of influence you see on the text, I said it's not pure Egyptian magic, and it certainly isn't. The other big influence, of course, is Greek religion and Greek magical ideas. You also, and Greek and Egyptian are the two biggest influences, which is why it's often called Greco-Egyptian magic. But the other big influence is Judaism. So you'll see throughout these texts, we're doing these spells, and you'll see Anubis and Osiris and Horus and Zeus and Hermes and all the gods you kind of expect. Then you'd also see Elohim, Sabaoth, Adonai, etc. referenced. And that's because there was a strong Jewish influence where these god names were brought in. That doesn't mean to say that the practitioners were Jewish. It's more likely that they viewed these words as names of power, magic words that just had power, and so they were incorporated into the spells. Most of the techniques are not taken from Judaism. In fact, most scholars think that this system of magic informed what later became Jewish magic. It's a sort of a cross-fertilization there. So that's the history of the text. That's what they are. And so let's, without further ado, jump straight into the magic and what that looks like. So the first thing that's interesting about the magic is the kind of things it's worked for. So in modern magic, those of us who practice today, there can often be a focus on magic that's for self-improvement and spiritual ends. So, performing the middle pillar and the LBRP daily to sort of circulate your body of light and whatnot. That wasn't really the sort of magic that was being done at this time, or certainly not in these texts. The PGM magic is largely for practical purposes. What's interesting is some of the rituals can have immense spiritual value. They can have, and there's a rite to Hermes, for example, where you effectively invoke him into yourself and unify your soul with Hermes, which is something that many modern practitioners would just want to do for the sake of it, because unifying your soul with that of a god is pretty awesome. But in this spell, it is done with the explicit purpose of bringing business to a shop. And so all of this, no matter how sort of highfalutin and beautifully spiritual magic is, it is usually grounded in a very practical purpose, often commercial. The other thing to be aware of with the way the gods are treated, which we'll talk more about later, is that they're often threatened and bound, and the magician will have something that Jack Grail calls a threat narrative, where he threatens to blot out the sun and do all sorts of terrible things if the god doesn't do what he wants them to do. And the gods and spirits are treated often like demons that need to be feared and bound and controlled, not necessarily divine entities to be worshipped, which pose some interesting problems for magicians working with them today. Not all the spells do this, but many do. And this does have precedent in early Greek religion, but it's it's often something that modern polytheists are quite uncomfortable with. And so, as I said, the gods are not sought out for their own sake, but rather for the miracles they can help the magician work. Now, there are exceptions to this, and these are the mystery rites, of which we have 3 main ones in the papyri. And these are rituals designed to, initiation rituals, in effect, that are designed to bring the initiate into communion with deity for the purpose of spiritual transformation, much like any other initiation ritual. And some scholars have debated about whether or not these should really be included in the corpus, because they are not practical magic like the rest of it. But I think they should be in there. I mean, they're part of papyri that have magic spells on them. And the reason I think they should be there is because it indicates the kind of other things that these magicians were interested in. Just as today, many people who practice magic are also initiates of mystery traditions such as Wicca. Back in the day, the magicians were often interested in the mysteries. Interest in mysteries and interest in magic have always gone hand in hand. And I think their inclusion in this corpus indicates that and shows that that is something that's been consistent throughout history. So that's the kind of magic that's being worked. Talking about the history of this magic and where it fits in. So Stephen Skinner and Jake Stratton-Kent, whose work you may have come across, they've shown convincingly that the PGM is the direct ancestor of the grimoire tradition. And so, well, certainly one of them, and thus the ancestor of pretty much all modern magic. So even in systems that use kind of more energy-based natural magic, we still owe a debt to the grimoires and thus to the PGM. And there are so many techniques that you see being used in the PGM that appear later than in the grimoires, such as gaining power over spirits using their names, which is an Egyptian idea, the use of child mediums, so children were believed to be quite pure, so you can invoke a spirit into them and they would act as the medium, threatening and binding spirits, and all sorts of other techniques, some of which we'll look at later. And so it very much has, these texts still have an influence on the way we do magic today. And as a magician reading these texts, a modern magician can see a lot of parallels, also some differences. So the one things to be aware of with this, with the way this system of magic works, is it's then the other area of magic to look at, which I think is the most interesting for modern practitioners, is the source of power, where power is derived from in these spells. So this is a spirit-based system of magic. The scholar and occultist Stephen Skinner gives a really nice definition of magic in the PGM when he says that magic is the art of causing change through the agency of spiritual creatures rather than via directly observable means. Such spiritual creatures being compelled or persuaded to assist by the use of sacred words or names, talismans, symbols, etc. So all the spells in these texts hinge on invoking spirits to achieve the magician's goals. And that is something that you need to be aware of if you wish to work with these texts, that working with the spirits is essential. And this is in contrast to natural magical systems, such as were first developed by the likes of Agrippa and Ficino in the early modern period. So in those systems, objects such as plants and gemstones are believed to be imbued with their own power that can be manipulated by the magician, and that's the roots of sort of the herbal and gemstone magic that we see so popular today. And in the sort of the 19th, 20th century, after a strong Eastern influence, you start to see this idea that humans have their own innate spiritual power, which you can draw out and raise and direct and so on. And this is the basis of how much magic has worked in witchcraft today. But this isn't the way magic works in the PGM. In the PGM, objects do not have any power of their own, nor do people. But instead, the objects are powerful because they are attractive and sacred to certain deities. And a magician gains his power by the coercion of the spirit world. So the magician, basically, his job is to coerce the spirits and get them to share their power with him. So it's a very different way of working and one to be aware of if you are trying to get involved with it. So sort of to sum up the magic side of things, the first thing to be aware of, this is a very large and varied corpus written by lots of people. It's not one coherent system of magic. If you pick this book up tomorrow and say, right, start here, finish there, it's not going to guide you through it. You need to be able to mine it and pick bits out and have a bit of a play with it. There are shared techniques and themes from which, if you're an enterprising magician, can extrapolate a system. There's the techniques and terminology are shared throughout the papyri, though often the terminology is used very differently. So in effect, what these texts are is they are a snapshot of how magic was being practiced in Egypt from the Hellenistic to the late antique period. And it's a system of magic that is rooted in practicality and in the manipulation of spirits. Okay, so with that covered, the next thing we should probably do is look at a spell. So, and I'm going to use this spell to introduce the concept of syncretism. I'll explain what that is and then we'll have a look at the spell. So syncretism is the process where two or more gods are combined to make a new one. And it is unsurprisingly, or they're linked and considered to be the same deity. It's unsurprising that in a text with such a diverse cultural background of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and a few other influences thrown in, that this is incredibly common in the PGM. I mean, the PGM is super. I mean, people like this eclectic magic today, but the PGM in certain elements is super eclectic, and I think this gets shown here. So the spell we're going to look at is the first one on the handout. Let's see if I can share my screen. Emily, can you enable participant screen sharing, please?
I believe so. I'm just having a look. Bear with me just one moment.
No worries. Just doing that. If you want to have a read through the first spell on the handout, and I'll read it through to you again in a moment and comment on some of the bits in it.
Yeah, by the looks of it, screen sharing is enabled, Tom.
Perfect. Let's give it a go again. No, it says it's not.
Okay, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you should see share screen.
Yeah, that's why I'm clicking, and it's coming up with a box saying host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, for Pete's sake.
Sorry, for the moment, I'll just read it aloud.
Right. Hang on, just one moment. You can share all participants. Okay, we should be good to go.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so can you all see that?
Yes.
Brilliant. So this spell is an extract from PGM 4, 3125-71. So that's how the referencing system works, by the way. So PGM, you put PGM, then the Roman numerals 4 refers to the papyrus, and then the numbers are a line reference. It's very similar to biblical referencing. And this is a syncretic statue spell. So taking Etruscan wax, mould a statue 3 handbreadths high. Let it be 3-headed. Let the middle head be that of a sea falcon, the right of a baboon, left of an ibis. Let it have 4 extended wings and its 2 arms stretched on its breast. In them it should hold a scepter. And let it be wrapped as a mummy like Osiris. Let the falcon wear the crown of Horus, the baboon wear the crown of Hermanubis, and let the ibis wear the crown of Isis. So there is a lot going on in this statue, because basically what this is some sort of hideous chimera of multiple gods. And I love it because it's just bizarre. So the magician is combining 3 or more gods into one statue. I think it's actually about 5 or 6. So it starts off with we've got the falcon. So a falcon that represents the god Horus, could be Ra as well, but likely Horus is because Horus is the Egyptian god of war and kingship. This is confirmed by the Horus identity is confirmed by him being given the crown of Horus. Next, the ibis wears the crown of Isis. Now, this is slightly odd, as ibises are usually associated with Thoth, not Isis, Thoth being the god of writing and magic. But Isis is a goddess of magic, so her inclusion, that's not unsurprising. And finally, you get the baboon, which is crowned with the crown of Hermanubis. And this is where the syncretization gets really wild. Because baboon is a symbol of Thoth, again, the god of magic and writing. Hermanubis is a syncretic deity, and he's a mixture of Anubis and Hermes. And if you scroll down on the handout, you'll be able to see this is a statue of Hermanubis from the Vatican Museum. And he is Hermes and Anubis combined. So Anubis was the Egyptian god of mummification. He was also a guide to the souls of the dead. He was a psychopomp. Hermes, as most people will know, was the god of messengers, of travel, also later of magic and wisdom. And he was also had the ability to ferry the soul, to take the souls, to guide the souls of the dead as well. So he also is a psychopomp. And basically, you combine Hermes and Hermanubis, and you get the psychopomp god par excellence. And he's a very popular god in the Greek Magical Papyri. And he had a small but significant following in the period when these papyri were written. If you're interested in working with him, Gordon White in his book Chaos Protocols gives quite a nice ritual for doing so. So if we look at the statue of him, we can kind of see how the syncretism worked. So you've effectively got a fairly standard statue of Hermes with the caduceus and sort of Greek dress, but then he's got a jackal's head, which is unusual because you don't normally see Greek statues with animal heads. So that's slightly odd, but the statue is very much Greek style, but with that distinctly Egyptian head, and with that sort of sun disk between what looks like a sun disk between his ears. So it's very much a sort of a Greek take on an Egyptian sort of idea, and I think he is possibly one of the most visibly syncretic magical deities out there, because you can quite see he's literally Anubis's head stuck on Hermes' body, and sometimes it's not a lot more complicated than that how it works. So going back to the spell, his inclusion is interesting because you've got Hermanubis, the crown of Hermanubis being stuck on the head of the baboon, which is sacred to Thoth. Now, Thoth is also often syncretized with Hermes, who in turn is part of Hermanubis. You've got kind of a triple layer syncretization going on here, which is God piled on top of God, piled on top of God. And so you've got, it's a triple syncretization. And the levels of syncretization just get even more wild when you start looking at the invocation. So the invocation doesn't reference the gods in the statue at all. Instead, it calls on more Greek entities. So it goes like this. Give me all favour, all success, for the angel bringing good who stands beside the goddess Tyche is with you. Accordingly, give profit and success to this house. He is Ion, ruler of hope, giver of wealth, O holy Agathos daemon, bring to fulfilment all your favours and divine oracles. So you've got Tyche, who's a personification of fate and justice. You've got this Ion, which is just the name for kind of the god of all, effectively. And then you've got the Agathos daemon, which is a spirit of a personification of good fortune, effectively, that's very popular in Hellenistic religion. So you've got 3 more deities thrown into the invocation. So you're looking at this and you go, how do you make sense of this? Well, there are 2 things that are very apparent. First of all, the idea, clearly the concept of what constituted a god was very fluid. They were willing to mix their gods up. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment. But I mean, we see in the invocation, this is a spell for prosperity. It says, give profit and success to this house. House could also be temple, shop, or anything like that. The idea is to bring prosperity to a place. For me, when I read the spell, I kind of feel like the magician has just gone, right, all the magical gods that might be useful, stick them in a statue and just kind of hedging his bets and just trying to pick anyone vaguely useful. Yes, you can come and help. Tyche, why not? Come over here. Let's help me get some money in this shop. And who knows? He may have had a more. I'd say he may have been she as well. A more nuanced and philosophical underpinning for this. Personally, though, I think this is one of those spells that is perhaps not as genius as other parts. I think this is very much let's just lump them all in together and see what results we get. But this has some interesting implications for modern practitioners, because it becomes very clear that these people did not see the gods as separate, distinct beings. They were able, or certainly not. They may have been distinct at certain points, but they were able to very much be intermingled at others. And this sort of wild syncretism, maybe this wild is unique to the PGM. You do see syncretism throughout the history of both Greek and Egyptian religion. So Greeks and Egyptians have long treated their gods as effectively the same deities under different guises. So, for example, in the early Ptolemaic period, which is the period when Egypt was ruled by Greek pharaohs in the wake of Alexander's conquest, there is a letter. We have a letter from Egyptian priests of Isis, and they're writing to the pharaoh in Greek. And they refer to Isis, their goddess, as Aphrodite. So even the Egyptian priests themselves, in a time when their Egyptian religion was still going strong, were more than happy to equate their gods with Greek ones. And this gets closer to the period now, the PGM, a few hundred years later, they're still prior to it. We have Apuleius' Golden Ass, or the Metamorphoses, which is a Latin novel, which if you haven't read it, do it. It's bizarre, it's wacky, and it's fantastic. But there's a bit at the end where Isis appears, and she gives one of the texts, which I think was an inspiration for the Charge of the Goddess today, where she gives a list of goddess names that she's known to by other cultures, and sort of I think she says Demeter and Hecate and so on, and so that idea of gods being other gods in disguise was very well established, and then syncretism became particularly prominent in the Hellenistic period. So this is in the wake of Alexander's conquest. Alexander had taken the Greeks across the world, right up to India. Then he died, and the empire had fragmented. But you now had Greeks spread all over sort of Europe and Asia. And as the Greeks went, they would meet local gods, and they would syncretize them with their own. And so you get Greek and Indian gods and Greek and Middle Eastern gods and all sorts of different gods all kind of mixed together. And this, and you get thousands and thousands of examples. We do some research. There are so many, both textual and artifactual sources showing this. And the Romans did it too. So I mean, here in the UK, in Bath, for example, famously, it was originally dedicated to a Celtic goddess called Sulis. The Romans turned up and went, "Oh, this looks like our Minerva," and it became Sulis Minerva. So this has led some, and synchronization took place both at a folk level, so just ordinary people doing this, and also it happened for political reasons at a higher up level. So the Ptolemies, the Greek pharaohs, for example, sponsored the cult of Serapis, which was a syncretic Greek and Egyptian deity, and that was to help bridge the gap between Greeks and Egyptians and solidify their rule. Is my shared screen gone? You still see that?
The shared screen's gone off.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. So this has there are some scholars actually who go so far as to say the discrete deities, Zeus being Zeus, Hera being Hera, and Apollo being Apollo, and all not mixing, being separate gods, may never really have been existed in the level of religion as it was practiced day to day. And they say that it only really existed in the whitewashed intellectual poetry and sculpture that we tend to associate with the classical age, so the works of Ovid, Virgil, etc. So syncretism has always been a key part of ancient polytheism. And this can pose difficulties for modern polytheists. For many modern pagans, we wrestle with the idea of are our gods individual beings, or are they aspects of a greater whole, or somewhere in between? And that is a question that you all have to answer for yourselves. But if you look at the ancient sources, certainly, you'll see that certainly the identities and relationship with gods were very, very fluid. I think hard polytheism does not seem to be as commonplace as people who first get into this might think. So, moving on so that's the gods. We'll be encountering more of them later because they are included in a lot of the spells. But I thought before we get into the really heavy stuff, I thought we'd take a quick break to look at the joke spells. And this is we've talked about some quite academic concepts, and what I want to try and get across is how utterly bizarre some aspects of these texts are, and I think that's what's so wonderful about them. It makes them a continuous joy to both study and work with. And so you'll find in the 7th papyrus, PGM 7, tucked away in between some very good, very high quality occultism, brilliantly thought out spells, you get Democritus's table gimmicks, which are in effect a load of practical jokes. And I thought I'd read through a few of them with you and have a look at them. So first of all, one of my favorite, this one that says, to make an egg become like an apple, boil the egg and smear it with a mixture of egg yolk and red wine. I think the idea being, I assume that you hard boil an egg, paint it red, tell your friend it's an apple, hand it to them, they eat it, and you film it and put it on TikTok and laugh about it. There's another one which says, to make the chef unable to light the burner, set a house leek plant on his stove. I suppose the logic being that you can't light the stove if there's a plant on it. I mean, yeah, it checks out. There's a good one. So to keep an old woman from either chattering or drinking too much. I think many of us may have that problematic grandparent who causes a bit too much trouble at Christmas dinners. Don't worry. Mince some pine and put it in her mixed wine, and she'll be docile as anything. Brilliant. That's what we need. There's another one that says, to make the gladiators painted on your cups fight. So I'm sure you've all seen the beautiful Greek vases with all the image figures on them. Well, if you smoke some hare's head underneath them, The gladiators will appear to fight, which basically means get high and it will look like the statues, the pictures on your vases are fighting. Try and get back to me. There's one for the introverts. If you have difficulty intermingling, so socializing, smear some gum mixed with wine and honey on your face. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Give it a go. Then there's, of course, being human. In the end, it all comes down to sex. So to be able to copulate a lot, wind up 50 tiny pine cones, tiny mind you, don't want to think you're compensating, with 2 ounces of sweet wine and 2 pepper grains and drink it. And apparently that will help you copulate a lot. And then the final one, the best one, is to get an erection whenever you want. So grind up a pepper with some honey and coat your, what the translator has quite charmingly called, thing. Now, I hope I don't need to tell you that you really shouldn't put pepper on your penis. That would be rather uncomfortable. And one can only imagine that the magician who had this text was, his friend comes along to me and goes, "Wait, mate, look, I know you're a wizard, right? I've been having a bit of a trouble in the bedroom. Wife's not too happy, needs some help." And he says, "Don't worry, friend, I've got you, I've got you. This is an ancient spell back from the mists of time. Follow these instructions and you'll be laughing." Of course, his friend does that, gets that, and then has a very painful willy indeed. And everyone laughs at him and points and laughs. "Ah, what an idiot, he put pepper on his dick." There you go. So it's this is part of the papyri, and I think it's really important to remember these, not just because it's funny, but because it shows that the magicians of the ancient world were human like us. They were just as silly and ridiculous as people are today. There's been a long and venerable tradition of genius but dickhead magicians, Aleister Crowley being a famous one, and I think, and that is a tradition that has gone, that has clearly continued from the ancient world. And yeah, so I love this section because it makes me laugh and it shows the humanity of people we're dealing with, and I think that's very important when working with ancient texts. So, moving on then from some humour into one of the personally one of my favourite parts of the things I find very interesting, and that is the paradros. So the paradros is a magical entity that's fairly unique to PGM. You see the word paradros crop up at various points in various Greek texts, but you only see it used this way in the PGM. And the paradros, some call it a familiar spirit. I think that's quite anachronistic because the concept of familiars is a medieval one. But the word paradros in Greek literally means sitting beside, and it is best translated as assistant. It is a powerful magical entity that provides the source of all the magician's powers. So remember, a magician's power in these texts comes from spirits, not from himself. And there is a special bond between the magician and his paradros. And what these spells usually serve to do is find some way to bind the magician and the paradros together. This is not the approach all of them take. It gets quite complicated. There are various different kinds of paradros, and they all work with slightly differently. But I'm going to talk to you about one of the most famous ones today. I'm sort of saying one of the most distinctive ones. And the first 2 spells in the PGM1 in the first papyrus are paradros spells to require a paradros, suggesting that the author of that papyrus viewed them as essential. There's no significance in them being in the first papyrus because that order is modern and arbitrary, but certainly the fact that they're the first things on this particular papyrus suggests they were important to that author. Whether all the authors viewed them as essential to magic is unknown, but the paradros is certainly an important and unique feature of the PGM, and many modern magicians who work with the system make the paradros a key part of their practice. So I'm going to look in details at one of the spells to conjure one now. And there are 10 different paradros spells. I'm just going to look at one that's more interesting. This spell contains a lot of key features of Greco-Egyptian magic, and it has many parallels with grimoire magic as well. Don't worry if you're sitting here going, "I still don't get what a paradros is." You'll have a better idea by the end of the spell, but you still won't know because I spent a year writing about these things, and the honest answer is the magicians weren't sure either. It's not clear. The only way to figure out what one is to summon it yourself. I think the best way to try and get some understanding of them is to look at how the spells invoking them work. So yes, paradros, that's the correct spelling. So let's have a look at this spell. So this is PGM1, 42 to 195. And this is the spell of Panuthis, the sacred scribe, for acquiring an assistant. It's a paradros spell. So I'm going to read the first paragraph through, and there's loads of things. I'm going to pick them out and have a look at how it all fits together. So, after the preliminary purification, abstain from animal food and from all uncleanliness. And on whatever night you want to, go up onto a lofty roof after you have clothed yourself in a pure garment, and say the first spell of encounter as the sun's orb is disappearing, with a holy black Isis band on your eyes. And in your right hand grasp a falcon's head. And when the sun rise it, hail it as you shake its head, recite this sacred spell as you burn uncut frankincense and pour rose oil, making the sacrifice in an earthen censer on ashes from the plant heliotrope. And as you recite the spell, there will be this sign for you. A falcon will fly down and stand in front of you, and after flapping its wings in mid-air and dropping an oblong stone, it will immediately take flight and ascend to heaven. You should pick up this stone, carve it at once and engrave it later. Once it has been engraved, bore a hole in it, pass a thread through and wear it around your neck. But in the evening, go up to your household again, and facing the light of the goddess, address to her this hymnic spell, as you again sacrifice myrrh troglodytes in the same fashion. Light a fire and hold a branch of myrtle, shake it, and salute the goddess. So there's loads going on here. I'm just going to go through and we'll break it down as we go. So first of all, in the first thing, you've got this preliminary purification. And that is something that you will see in lots of PGM texts, and even where it's not stated, that most people seem to think that was generally expected, that one would be in a pure state to do magic. What does that mean? Probably having a bath, wearing clean clothes, not being a vegetarian diet often. There's a long history of vegetarianism in magic, and particularly at this time there was a very dominant stream of Platonic philosophers who believed that you shouldn't eat animal flesh, and that had been started much earlier by the Pythagoreans as well. And the Egyptians as well had all sorts of complex. We often think this wrongly, that the food taboos are a sort of Jewish and Islamic thing, but they weren't. The Egyptians had very complex ones as well, and ideas of what was clean and unclean food. I once spent a day picking through all of these complex ideas, and I'm not sure I'd recommend it, because it's very, very, very logistical, but there are all sorts of different ones. And other forms of uncleanliness would be things like corpses, menstruating women, because they're misogynists, and various other things. Also sex was generally considered a bad idea. You'll see this idea of purification carries on into the grimoires. Most of the grimoires, I mean, the Solomonic Cave of Solomon, for example, has very long, complex purification processes, and that kind of starts here. Then the next thing that's worth commenting on is the ingredients, and this is one thing I found really exciting when I was reading this, because obviously today we've got these beautiful books that list all the planetary associations of the different plants and herbs, so you can use correspondences to build your incenses and whatever that you're doing in your magic. But these planetary associations of the plants started here. They've existed. They've been around as long as certainly up to this period, and quite possibly before. So you see frankincense. So when you're addressing the sun, you burn frankincense and on the ashes of heliotrope. And frankincense, of course, today has solar associations, and quite clearly did then as well. And on the ashes of heliotrope, the helio in that name of that plant is a clue that it's associated with the sun. So you've got these plants that we associate with the sun today, and that association is ancient. And then later, when he's addressing the moon, that's the goddess. Myrrh and myrtle, again, what substances we today would also consider lunar, and he's using those there. And the other thing in the ingredients that you see is the animal sacrifice with the falcon's head. The falcons don't have very big heads, so I kind of imagine him sort of like holding it kind of like that. I mean, like, it's a bit weird, but the was quite difficult to hold. But anyway, the animal sacrifice is a key feature of a lot of these spells, and we'll talk a little bit about it later on. And then this bit about this oblong stone. So the oblong stone is used to make something called a phylactery, which is a protective talisman that you would wear for a performance of the rite. Because as I said at the beginning, the gods and spirits were perceived as dangerous. There was danger inherent in this magical work, and so you needed to protect yourself. And so some spells prescribe a particular layman or phylactery, and others don't. But there is one, I can't remember the reference for it. There is a spell in the papyri that for making just a general one. And you see this again in the with sort of like grimoires like the Goetia, where you have to have a protected talisman when you're evoking the spirits as well. What's unusual about this is the falcon delivery service. That is unusual. Normally you just go and find a rock, but this one gets delivered by falcon. Very efficient. I mean, sure. Try it and find out if it works. I mean, you've got to find a falcon's head first, but you get stone delivered by falcon. That's and that is quite a unique feature of the spell that I think is quite quirky and fun. And then you see this other thing, which is that you see it very clearly describes what's going to happen and the vision you're going to have of this falcon. And this is quite common in the papyri. The spells will give very vivid descriptions of what is supposed to happen. A bit like in the grimoires where the demons are described, given detailed description of how they're supposed to look. That happens here too. So let's have a look at the next bit, the vision that is supposed to happen as a result. And this is where we start to look at the bit being a bit more. So at once there will be a sign for you like this. A blazing star will descend and come to a stop in the middle of the housetop. And when the stars dissolve before your eyes, you will behold the angel whom you have summoned, and who has been sent to you. And you will quickly learn the decisions of the gods. But do not be afraid. Approach the god and take his right hand. Kiss him and say these words to the angel, for he will quickly respond to you about whatever you want. But you adjure him with this oath that he meet you and remain inseparable, and that he not keep silent or disobey you in any way. When he has with certainty accepted this oath of yours, take the god by the hand and leap down. And after bringing him into the narrow room where you reside, sit him down. After first preparing the house in a fitting manner and providing all types of foods and Mendesian wine, set these before the god, with an uncorrupted boy serving and maintaining silence until the angel departs. And you address the preliminary words to the god. I shall have you as a friendly assistant, a beneficent god who serves me whenever I say, quickly by your power now appear on earth to me, yea, verily God. And while reclining, you yourself quickly speak about what you propose. Test this oath on the god of what you wish. But when 3 hours have passed, the god will immediately leap up, order the boy to run to the door and say, Go, Lord, blessed God, where you live eternally, as you will. And the god vanishes. So those of you familiar with the Conjuration of Spirits will immediately see a lot of parallels and similarities here. So in the first instance, this vision, the vision is described in incredible depth. It's very detailed of what is supposed to happen. Now, is this supposed to be a physical manifestation or just a vision that you have? I have no idea. I haven't done it. Didn't have a falcon's head to hand. A lot of as I said, a lot of grimoires do describe visions like this. But there is no mention here of a vision appearing in a scrying mirror or incense smoke. Some scholars suggest that the uncorrupted boy may have been meant to serve as a medium. But, I mean, that's quite that's not really made clear. I mean, it might be. I mean, and it could be that he maintains silence because the angel's speaking through him, but not clear because there's that whole visual bit at the beginning as well. And then you get this idea of eating and drinking with the paradros, which is a common thing you see in the papyri. Most of the paradros and other spells and some meeting with gods involve eating and drinking with them. I talked earlier about how it's difficult to find out what these spirits actually are supposed to be, and already you see the ambiguity in that it's referred to both God and angel multiple times. And various scholars have tried to figure out what that might mean and sort of justify it in certain ways. And the honest answer is you can't really, because we have to bear in mind angel didn't mean then the same thing angel means now. This is long before the like sort of medieval angelic hierarchies and like sort of codified idea of angelology. Angel at this point could literally just meant anything that's basically served as a mouthpiece or intermediary from God. Angelos literally means messenger. Anything that basically had the role of divine messenger could be referred to as an angel. And so and you see the word angel used interchangeably with daemon and God and so on throughout these texts, because any being functions as an intermediary can have this role. And so it could be both an angel and a god. because an angel is a role rather than a species of being. You'll notice that the angel is bound by an oath. Again, very common grimoire practice of you charge and bind them once they show up. And then, of course, you have a license to depart at the end. Of course, as everyone should know, if you conjure something, you've got to make sure you give it like you banishes at the end with a license to depart. You've got a very simple one: "Go, Lord, blessed God, where you live eternally, as you will." It's the which I think has parallels to many sort of license to depart in various traditions. So the technology of conjuring spirits, the essential sort of techniques of what happens, hasn't changed. That remains. That was the same then as it is now in the grimoire. And the use of an oath and a name to bind the spirit is very common in PGM. The angel gives you a name, which is the name of the angel is actually given in the spell. It's again, it's a voces magicae. It has no translatable meaning. I've not included the main invocation and oath here, and that's because they are made up of barbarous words of power, or voces magicae. Voces magicae, literally magical voices, magical words. And these are nonsense words and divine names that give the magician power over a spirit. They are a consistent feature of nearly every spell in the papyri. They are not translatable. The chaos magicians today have a theory that they are the chanting of these words of power that don't mean anything to your conscious mind, help tap into your unconscious and put you in a trance state. And whilst I think having used them, that's definitely true, that isn't the way the ancients would have viewed them. They would have considered them the divine names and words of power that gives one control over the spirits. So finally, looking at the last element of this spell, and this tells you a little about what this paradros is actually supposed to do for you, why you would want a paradros. The spell is hugely long, and it gives a long list of all the paradros's powers. It's things like controlling the weather, finding spirits, telling the future, conjuring illusions. There's a bit where you can conjure like a whole marquee with servants and stuff to have a feast. The one thing it says without him, nothing happens. So as I said before, the magician does not have any power of his own. The paradros is the explanation for all power, all the miracles a magician is supposed to be able to work. It is understood that this is done through a paradros. So it says here, if anyone asks you, what do I have in mind, or what has happened to me, or even what is going to happen, question the angel, and he will tell you in silence. But you speak to the one who questions you as if from yourself. When you are dead, he will wrap up your body as befits a god, but he will take your spirit and carry it into the air with him. For no aerial spirit which is joined with a mightier system will go into Hades, but to him all things are subject. So the first bit there, that's about psychic power, the ability to tell the future. And what this is saying is it's not actually the magician telling the future, even though to the uninitiated it would look that way. It is actually the angel speaking through him, but only the magician can perceive their paradros. And what's interesting is at the start of the spell, the magician and the paradros are very much viewed as separate beings. What I argued when I wrote my scholarly commentary on this spell is that actually, by the end of the spell, the paradros and the magician can be considered as one being. Because you see, certainly to others, it appears so. But also you notice at the beginning of the spell, not in the extra time I've given you, but at the beginning of the spell, the angel is described as an aerial spirit. And at the end, you see the magician himself is being described as an aerial spirit that is joined with the mighty assistant. So, and the body is wrapped up as befits a god, and the spirit is taken into the air. So by the process of this spell, this unification of the paradros, this deifies the magician. The magician becomes a god himself, and after death is eternally bound to this spirit, and they become as one being. So this is one of those spells where the goals of it are largely practical, because the long list of things, as I said, things like controlling the weather and conjuring up food and whatnot. But there is a powerful spiritual element to this as well, and that this is a work of apotheosis, of self-deification as well. I think the ancients would have argued that's very practical, because if you're a god, you can do whatever you like, really. So there's both practical and spiritual uses. So to sum up, the paradros is certainly this kind of paradros, is a divine being that starts as separate to the magician, but through the process of magic is bound to the magician's soul. And it is the explanation for all the magical powers the magician is supposed to have. and it makes them unto a god. It is a process both of achieving practical, concrete powers and deification, and was believed to be a key part of magic for many of these magicians. That's the paradros. Let's now, what I want to do now, we're now going to look at a separate entity, and that is the personal daemon, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of. So the question is, what's a personal daemon? And the answer to which is, depends who you ask. The personal daemon is either the divine part of the soul, just another name for the soul, or a spirit attached to the soul at birth. Those are the three main theories that various different philosophers offer. And the ancients disagree on the matter. It's a key feature of Platonic philosophy. So Plato, Plutarch, Iamblichus, they all give various views on it. And I very much view it as sort of the ancient origin of the modern concept of the holy guardian angel. I'm not the only one who's made that link. They are very, very similar entities, that idea of the divine higher self. And just as most magicians today can't agree on what the HGA is, most of the philosophers couldn't agree on what the personal daemon was either. But nonetheless, they all agreed it was important. So contact with the personal daemon was a key part of something called theurgy, specifically Neoplatonic theurgy. What is theurgy? Theurgy was a form of practical Platonic philosophy. Nowadays, often just used to refer to any magic that's sort of divinely, spiritually orientated, but originally had a more specialized meaning. And it was used ritual magic to directly experience the gods and daimons in order to realize philosophical truths and spiritually transform the theurgist. So this is why I say spiritually motivated magic was absolutely being done. It's just not what's usually seen in the papyri. Now, theurgy was started by Iamblichus in the 3rd/4th century CE. There were other notable practitioners, including Julian the Apostate, the emperor who tried to return the Roman world empire to paganism. I always think that was cool. One of the Roman emperors was a magician. Oh, that's awesome. It had a huge influence on the Greek Magical Papyri, particularly the personal daemon and paradros spells. And there are only actually 2 spells that directly reference the personal daemon. There's a couple of others that scholars have said might be personal daemon spells, though I don't really think they are. But I'm going to pick one of them that is absolutely a personal daemon spell. And this is quite a short one, so it's not too long. And this is PGM 7, 478 to 490. And you'll see it's from the same papyrus as the practical jokes. So this is what I mean of the juxtaposition of magic and jokes. So it goes like this. It's a dream incubation. So, Eros, darling, passalion et. Send me my personal daemon tonight to give me information about whatever the concern is. For I do this on order of Panchuchi Thasu, at whose order you are to act, because I conjure you by the 4 regions of the universe, Apsar Gael, Chachu, Meliut, Memeliut, and by the one who is above the 4 regions of the universe, Kish Memeliuth. This is the offering. Oh, sorry, add the usual. This is the offering. Take equal portions of dirt from your sandal, of resin, and of the droppings from a white dove, and while speaking the invocation, burn them as an offering to the bear. Phylactery for this. Write these names on a strip of tin. Achachael, Chachu, Mamaliuti. Then wear it around your neck. After uttering the summons, go to your quarters, put out the lamp, and sleep on a newly made bed of rushes. So, words in capitals, for starters, those are the voces magicae that I talked about earlier, those untranslatable words of power. And so in this spell is the idea being the magician casts the spell, he goes to sleep, and has a vision in the night, a dream of their personal daemon. And I'll go through again in order and talk about some of these things. So first of all, the interesting thing here is that use of eros. Eros, and the translator has translated eros, darling. The Greek is erotule, tule being a sort of an affectionate term, sort of little eros. It's eros, darling is a nice translation. So it's already an affectionate opening, and sort of powers of love are called on because the bear is linked to Aphrodite in the PGM. There are other spells that link the two. The bear being Ursa Major. constellation. And the white dove, of course, is sacred to Aphrodite. And rather than using something that smells nice to do with Aphrodite, they decided to use dove shit instead. I mean, okay, fair enough. That's what you want to burn. Go for it. And it's like this spell seems to be no scholars before had seemed to comment on why this love element is in the spell. Why is he doing? Why have they used Eros to contact your personal daemon? It's like the magician is casting a love spell on their daemon to draw it towards them. And many I've certainly been trained. Many magicians are trained to do their invocations as if they are calling to a lover, to call with that affection, and that is what you're seeing here. And I think it's a very clever idea because it's not something that you necessarily see advocated for in Neoplatonic texts, but they are casting a love spell to draw their personal daemon towards them. And it's particularly fitting as this is a dream spell. It happens at night. So the personal daemon comes to you like a lover in your sleep. You see, that's one of the interesting things. Then there's this 4 regions of the universe, and the one who rules above it, God, obviously. And the lords of the universe are used to compel Eros to do this. And this is broadly in line with a teaching from Iamblichus, because he says the invocation of the personal daemon is effected through one god who is lord of the daemons. So you invoke the power of God and the 4 regions of the universe to compel these spirits. But the use of Eros as an intermediary is unique, with the personal daemon is unique to this spell, although Eros does fulfill an intermediary role in other spells in Papyri as well, just not with the personal daemon. And this shows what I think is quite brilliant, is it shows how this magician has given their own personal interpretation of theurgy and innovated on the concept. And I think that is one that's really important here, is how innovative this magic is. Then there's this bit, do the usual. This is the typically unhelpful thing, and this, I think, illustrates better than anything else how these are the working notes of a magician. These are not designed to be instructions you can just pick up and work with. They are they're just the working notes. He would have known what the usual was. You've got to figure it out for yourself. So one of the challenges is coming up with a ritual framework and structure for using these spells if you wish to do so today. And then there's this thing about dreams and the significance of dreams. The many when I first saw this, I was like, why is he using dreams? Why is this important? And I did some research around trying to find something, and eventually I figured it out when I went to Plutarch. He was a Middle Platon, this precedes this text. He, in his wonderful De Defectu Oraculorum, literally on the cessation or on the failure of oracles, which I highly recommend anyone who does any magic that involves kind of invocation or oracular work must read this book. It's brilliant. And it's a philosophical dialogue. And one of the characters in it, then they basically present various theories of how oracles might work. And one of the oracles, one character claims that the oracle gets their power from the daimons, who are the spirits of the dead, and they talk through the oracle. And they ask, well, okay, so why do the spirits of the dead have the power to talk to see the future when we don't? And the answer is we do. He states that humans do have this power in life, but it is weakened. It is sort of constrained by our fleshy prison of our bodies. But it can occasionally burst forth in our dreams. So that offers an interesting interpretation of the spell, that it provides perhaps the exception to the rule that magicians don't have any power of their own. If the personal daimon is viewed as the magician's soul, then this spell becomes a way of accessing your own innate psychic powers, your own ability to make oracles and make prophecy by contacting your own divine self through dreams. So I think that illustrates this idea that you've got the dream magic, you've got the influence from theurgy, you've got the influence of the idea of Eros, sort of the innovative and creative way in which these magicians put these fantastic spells together. And how so I suppose there are and how a wider understanding of sort of general philosophy and history of the time can really help in understanding what's going on. So sort of to sum this up then, so a personal daimon, it's either the divine part of your soul, your soul, or a spirit attached to your soul at birth. In this spell, it seems to be that divine part of your soul. And it is, in this spell, it is contacted by, effectively a love spell being cast upon it to draw it towards you in your dreams. So that's the personal daimon. So we've covered a fair bit of ground, and thank you for sticking with me. We've talked about the history and the magic and the syncretism and the paradros and the personal daemon. And what we'll do, I thought we'd close by, before we have questions, last 10 minutes or so, by talking about, we've looked kind of the academic side of this, about some different spells and how they might work. But how can a modern occultist use the PGM? I mean, most of us here are practitioners. What we really want to do is do some magic. So how might we do that? First of all, when we try to use the PGM, there are a few issues that present themselves. One of the first ones is that this is not a coherent system. You have to figure it out for yourself. Once you get past that one, are willing to dive in. One of the first things is difficult ingredients. So, and some of the ingredients are really hard to get hold of today. For example, one of them involves having a wolf's head just lying around. I mean, I don't have one of those. You might do. I am running low on wolf's heads. Some purists will tell you that you must replicate the spells as closely as possible, or you are a terrible magician and shouldn't be on the path, blah, 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 blah. Personally, I think that's a load of crap. It's true, it's my belief that it is that's like in cooking. If you substitute something, it's going to change the flavour slightly. But magic is fluid, it is not chemistry. You can, of course, make substitutions and do workarounds. And I mean, these magicians did. Like, you look at all these different there are so many paradros spells and different ways of doing things. This is a very creative system of magic. And I think it would be doing these sources an injustice to throw our own creativity out the window when we use them in our magic. So don't be afraid to get creative with it. The wolf's head thing links into the of animal sacrifice. Now, I'm not opposed to animal sacrifice in principle. I eat meat. But I do not believe we are a culture that knows how to do it properly. There are those that do, for example, in African diaspora religions and so on, where animal sacrifice is practiced in a proper and humane way. But I think if you are not from a tradition like that, personally, I believe you have no business doing animal sacrifice because it is just not necessary, and it risks committing animal cruelty just for the sake of it, which I think is ridiculous. And also, many medical practitioners are vegan and vegetarian, so generally, animal sacrifice is usually a no-no. So that can be an issue, but there are workarounds and ways of sort of working around that, and I'll give an example of one in a moment. And finally, the other issue that might present itself is language. So there was a widespread belief that these spells should be said in the original language, or the powers would be lost. You see this reference in various ancient texts. I and most modern practitioners have not found this to be true. These spells work if you say them in English. Only thing I would say is keep the voces magicae as they are. They can't be translated anyway. Don't worry if you don't pronounce them like sort of Greco-Egyptian would have done. Of course you can't, but definitely keep those, because they are considered to be the key to the power, the key to calling on the spirits. So they need to be said. And so what I would recommend is, if you can learn the voces magicae by heart, brilliant. That's really tricky because it's difficult to learn gobbledygook. But their pronunciation is really important. So having said all that, how would I suggest you use the papyri? And of course, you must decide for yourselves how you wish to use them. But the way I advocate is I advocate mining them for good tech and invocations, using them as a source of inspiration and something to pull from. As I said, these are magicians' notes. They weren't ever meant to be followed as Holy Writ. So to give you an example, I've recently been doing some work on statue ensoulment, the idea. And so statue ensoulment was a common practice in the ancient world, particularly in Neoplatonic theurgy, which we talked about earlier. And the idea is that you call a divine spirit into a statue and make that statue a vessel of the god. And if you look at books on theurgy and Google statue ensoulment, you'll find various rites for this purpose, and they all claim inspiration from the PGM. So I thought, right, let's see what they're actually doing. So I went back to the PGM and I mined through went through all the spells. I read them all that do statue ensoulment. And there were several rituals. We looked at one of them earlier with the syncretic mashup. But they're all for specific purposes with specific gods, and they all use animal sacrifice. Well, I had my own purposes. I have my own gods, and I didn't want to do animal sacrifice, so I had to adapt. So I read all the spells, and I pulled out the key techniques, identified all the key techniques that were repeated in all of them. And this is what I found. So the writing of names on power on papyri and putting it on or under the statue or in it. And I didn't need to worry about using papyrus because they only used papyrus. That was the paper they had, so any paper will do. Making sacrifices to the statue. Luckily, my deity does not require aught in sacrifice, so I didn't have to worry about that one. That was already ruled out. But I could think of other traditional offerings that I could make. And petitions were often written on the statue. My statue was pre-made, so I was like, right, well, I'll include mine on paper with words of power on it. And then the statues are usually made from materials linked to the deity. As I said, my statue was pre-made, so what I did was I created an oil with materials sacred to the deity in it and used that to anoint the statue. And this actually has precedent in one PGM spell. There is a spell where exactly that is done with the lunar goddess. And then there's another interesting one that happens in a couple of spells where the sacrifices, which are usually birds, are strangled to give their breath to the statue. Now, I ain't strangling no birds, so I thought, well, that's okay. This concept of the breath of life, which you see in sort of the Kabbalistic tradition, the Jewish tradition, with sort of Adam Kadmon having the breath of life breathed into him, that is a common idea in Western magic. And certainly with the Jewish influence in the papyri, it doesn't seem wrong to bring that in. So I used that idea of breathing life into the statue. And I did this with the goddess from my own tradition, and it worked fantastically well. And I think that was a brilliant example to me of how there's some fantastic magical tech in these papyri, and if you draw that out, you can use it in really effective ways in your own practice. Another one that's more related to that is a good one if you want to do a spell that is straight out of the papyri, because there absolutely are spells you can do straight out of the papyri. And this is PGM 4 2785 to 890, the prayer to Selene for any spell, which is actually, despite what the heading says, basically an invocation of Hecate. And it's used, and it can be used prior to any spell, and there's even an incense given for doing good. Offer storax, myrrh, sage, frankincense, and a fruit pit, which are all things you can easily get hold of from a metaphysical store. And it's a long invocation which you can use, and I've used this in my own spells, and to great effect. It's a very, very powerful invocation. It's very long. This is just a short extract. And just interesting things worth pointing out about. I'm not going to read the whole thing through, but you see her being syncretized with all sorts of different things. You see her being syncretized with the fates, the Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos who weave the web of fate, or the one who strings the thread, cuts it, and so on. She's also associated with the Furies, those hideous demons from Tartarus who pursue wrongdoers. And she's described in quite fearful terms. She's described as your fearful serpents on your brow, and the roar of bulls resounds from your mouths. Your womb is decked with the scales of creeping things, and your back writhes with the poisonous rows of serpents. You are bound in horrifying chains. But then it also says, goddess whom men exalt, lady of many names, who bears fair offspring, bull-eyed, horned, mother of gods and men and nature, mother of all things. Few frequent Olympus and traverse on the broad and boundless chasm. You are the beginning and the end, and you alone rule all. So you're seeing her being syncretized with these terrifying Greek deities, with the great goddess, with, actually it's a biblical reference, you are the beginning and the end. So you've got all these things brought together in this invocation of Hecate. And I think when I was looking at the spell, I was a bit concerned. I was like, I really want to call on all these terrible, dreadful bits as well. But I think absolutely you do. Because I think the ancients understood something which sometimes we forget, that the gods are incredibly complex beings. Gods are, within themselves, are able to contain paradox because they are gods. And so to call upon all the paradoxical elements of these gods and bring them together is to give the truest representation one can put them into words, and thus most effectively connect to their power. And so this spell, if you want to look it up in the papyri, you can absolutely do so, find it, and burn some incense and do it. So we'll finish by, see, I've got a couple of questions coming through, and I'll look at those in a moment. We've got finish up before I take questions on as I said I would do, about Aleister Crowley's Bornless Rite, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, which is his ritual which he gives for giving contact to the Holy Guardian Angel. And he presents it in his Liber Samek, and he says it's the ideal rite for achieving knowledge and conversation with your Holy Guardian Angel, which, as I've said, is linked to personal daemon. He takes it directly from the papyri. And what is odd is he doesn't use any of the personal daemon spells. Instead, he bases it off an exorcism, the Stele of Dew, the hieroglyphics, which I printed on your handout. I'm not going to read the whole thing through. But what this spell does is it calls upon God, or the headless, bornless one, to give the magician authority to exorcise a demon. And this god is identified both with Ion, with the Jewish understanding of God, so Yabas, Yapos. Also with the headless one is actually an epithet of Bes, the dwarf god. He's a dwarf god that would pose naked and yell at demons to drive them away, which makes sense because it's an exorcism. But I always find it amusing when people talk about the bornless one and they're actually talking about a little squat dwarf deity going, rah! There's loads of pictures on me on Egyptian temples. Look them up, he's fun. And the spell goes through, and the magician ends with him identifying himself with God and speaking as him. And there's a huge Jewish influence on the spell, which you can see in the Yapos, references to Adonai and Moses. And what Crowley effectively does is he adapts this exorcism to make it a kind of almost self-exorcism, purifying himself and identifying himself with God in order to bring forward your own divine self, or HGA. And in his rite invokes the bornless one with the same beginning as the original. He changes bits, so I summon you headless one who created heaven and earth. Bornless are just different translations, so up to you what you use. He, in Crowley's rite, he identifies himself with an Egyptian prophetic name rather than Moses. In this way, he identifies himself as Moses. And he also includes his 5 elemental thelemic invocations as well. But he ends his with this same bit as well. Subject to me all daemons, so that every daemon, whether heavenly or aerial or earthly or subterranean, terrestrial, aquatic, etc., might be obedient to me in every enchantment and scourge which is from God. So, and he skips out some other parts from the original spell. But what he has done is he has taken an exorcism rite and turned it into a thelemic theurgic rite for gaining knowledge and conversation of your HGA. And I think that demonstrates how the way that sort of an adept magician such as Crowley used these texts. So you've got both my own examples, how I've done it, and how Crowley himself did it. And he, as I said, he's changed the rite. He has not used the original rite. So if it's good enough for Crowley, it should be good enough for you too. Feel free to get creative with this. So there we go. So to sum up, these texts are, the PGM is a huge corpus of text across 700 years of that incorporates the working notes of magicians, drawing on all sorts of different cultural influences. They're very syncretic, they're very creative. The magic is spirit-based. It's the ancestor of the grimoire tradition, all of modern magic. And modern magicians with a bit of creativity absolutely can use these texts, and I hope you do. So, there you go.
That's lovely, Tom. Thank you very much indeed for that. That was an excellent presentation. I'm very conscious of the time. Can I ask, if you have a question, can you raise your, sorry, can I just say, can you disable your screen sharing, Tom?
I'll turn that off. There we go. Stop share, there we go.
Ah, lovely. I can see everybody now. If you've got a question, can you just raise your hand or indicate on chat or something so that we can get through the questions as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I'm open to questions. I mean, if you've got one that you can ask now, then by all means go for it.
What is the Oracle book title that you mentioned?
I've just put that in the chat. That is De Defectio Oraculorum.
I'm not seeing it in the chat.
Oh, I've sent it to you privately. Didn't mean to do that. There we go.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And the origin of theurgy. So
theurgy is a Platonic system of magic that was developed first by Iamblichus. The first original work on theurgy is on the mystery. It's called on the De Mysteries, or on the mysteries. If you're interested.
I noticed there's a question here from Kevin. He's got quite a few questions. He wanted to know if you're open to questions outside of the talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. And a question about from Diane, who wants to read more about PGM and learn more about it?
So the first book, of course, is
Oh, yes.
PGM itself. The other one is this one, Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic by Dr. Stephen Skinner. This book's brilliant because what he does is he goes through and he gives both the history and background, and then he breaks down the techniques. And most usefully, what he does, I find, is he categorizes all the different spells and puts them in categories with references, which is so useful because trying to find spells in this is a nightmare. So this, if anything, is just a really good index. But his history and context is good too. I don't agree with all his historical conclusions, but it's certainly an invaluable book if you're starting out with this.
Okay. Monique, you've got a question, I believe. Hang on.
You answered them in the chat for me. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Right.
There's a question about intrinsic power. How does the magician compel or convince the spirit to make an oath? Variety of ways of doing that. So it's a tricky one because obviously it's a bit of a paradox. The magician must have some power if he's able to convince the spirits. But he will do things. A common one, as I said, is the threat narratives. So the notion of threatening to do terrible things if the gods don't do as they're told. The other one is it's basically the magical equivalent of asking to speak to the manager. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, you've got to do this because otherwise I'm going to tell on you to the god who's above you. And it's using sort of going down that chain of command. And if you're basically asking the right person to get them to compel them to do what you want. And I mean, the way it's approached is slightly different. There's the other thing that is quite common is the self-identification with deity. So I already mentioned that sort of vocation. The identification of the magician with a deity to temporarily assume that deity's authority is another very common technique.
Thank you. And one other question. I noticed that some of the names were pronounced with a CH, like in the word chat. I thought they were sometimes pronounced like the word lock. Can you explain how to pronounce each way?
My honest answer is you're probably lock. I wasn't there in ancient Greece and Egypt. It's a Greek. I mean, one of my favorite things that my Greek and Latin teacher at uni ever said to me. The only thing apparently we can say for certain about ancient Greek is that it was spoken with a Surrey accent. Because we will all invariably pronounce it the way we do. I mean, if you look at the way the Golden Dawn pronounced Hebrew, they certainly didn't pronounce it the way a Jewish person would. So I think, if I'm completely honest, answer is I'm honestly not sure how it should be pronounced. I've pronounced it slightly different every time, and it still seems to work. So I wouldn't get too bogged down in that. But if you're really interested, I would find someone who's a native Greek speaker. And again, even modern Greek is different to ancient Greek. So
yeah. Tom, that has been absolutely wonderful. As Thomas said, he is available to speak to answer questions outside the session, but I'm very conscious that we're now well over time.
Sorry about that. I thought we had more time than we did.
Don't worry, Tom. I don't think anyone is complaining. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. If you want to find me and ask me more questions, the best way to get me, the one that I use for magic, I am in the Facebook group by a different name, but I use my Twitter for magic stuff mostly. And I'm on Twitter as Tom McArthur 777. I'm just Tom McArthur. So if you find me on there, that's the best place to chat to me about magic.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you all of you for attending. It's one of the largest attendances we've had so far. But as they say, all good things come to an end. So I'm going to thank you and wish you all goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.